Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derek. With me, as always, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right. So let's dive in. We've got 3 episodes dedicated to a single verse, Genesis 2:15. So I'll read it real quick.
Excited.
The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and keep it. So at this point, you're probably wondering how in the world we're going to squeeze 3 episodes out of that verse.
Because we're
So
closet Puritans.
yeah, prepare for the magic trick, I guess.
There we
But
go.
this is another verse, right? That it seems to be little more than some material detail, and it's very easy to brush over.
Mhm.
Not a lot of thought given to it. However, I think if we take a closer look at this, we'll see that there's quite a bit you can learn from this, right?
Mhm.
So one of the first things that is worth realizing here is something that I think is sort of misunderstood at times. And when I say that, I throw myself into the bucket of having this misunderstanding at one point, right? As Christians, we do understand the idea of a new heaven and a new earth representing kind of a return to Eden and a return to humanity in a state that is no longer corrupted by sin, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
There can be a tendency for people to sometimes see this new status quo as being one of a paradise.
Mhm.
And that's in part because the Hebrew words in these passages for garden and all that kind of stuff don't really relate to the idea of paradise, but the Greek translation does. So that may be responsible for some of that confusion along the time, is
Mm.
that the Greek word does relate to the idea of paradise. Um, but and we associate paradise with being free from work, right? no
Mhm.
longer no longer carrying a burden, right?
Yep. Yeah.
um and I think that that is kind of a naive perception of humanity's ultimate destiny.
Yeah.
um Now, I think there is certainly truth to the idea of being freed from some burdens, right? However, it's the burdens of sin that will be lifted.
Mhm.
It's the consequences of sin that will be wiped away, and we'll see more of what those are in at the end of next chapter. But just as a subtle hint, basically, it's making this work that is described more difficult, right?
Mhm.
Um, but here, I think what we're seeing is that the idealistic state of humanity is one that actually is built around work. It requires work.
Mhm.
And we could look at it as saying we are creatures designed for what I think of now as sacred work, is what we're
Mhm.
designed for.
Mhm.
So with that in mind, I want to look at the rest of sort of this verse and its context within the passage and within, these chapters, for an idea of what is the kind of work we're meant for. What is sacred work? What does that mean?
Yeah.
All right.
Let's pause before we
Go
jump
ahead.
into that, just
Yeah.
because I think it's important to emphasize that this shows the depth of the knowledge of this story, because it's very easy to just assume that an ideal state is one of not working. And however, anybody who has experience in life, more than let's say 30 years of experience in life, tends to begin to understand that, look, you can only sit on a beach so long. You can
Yeah.
only, I think, like in the words of Tim Ferriss, you can only have so many mai tais, I think is what he says all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though he's the author of a book that touts having a very short work week, and that's how he
Right.
made his name. But he said, look, that's not the idea. The idea is not to just completely quit work. The idea is to do significant work.
Yes.
And that I think is what we're beginning to lean into. So I think it's important to emphasize that this is something that's commonly understood by people who gain experience in life external of Christianity. They begin to realize this.
Right.
And
Right.
if you look at it and you're learning this from the time, you're young, you have a head start on understanding long before that even in this idyllic state, there are things to do, and there are things that you need to do and have to
Yes.
do.
but you're
your
designed
obligations
to,
and
right?
responsibilities that you are designed to fill.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that paradise is not one just of carnal delights or just
Right.
of relaxation. That's
Leisure.
not, yeah, that's not, I mean, that's death, actually.
Yeah.
That's what being dead is not doing anything. And so there is encouragement for that. And this is where you see a lot of times proper ordering in the Bible, because it also encourages, which we've talked briefly about already in an episode, but days of rest.
Mm-hmm.
So it contextualizes work a lot too.
Yeah.
But that's important to understand, is that I think that this gives more credence even to these stories, that they thousands of years ago had this already understood, that people nowadays are beginning to say, oh wait,
Right.
no, just being freed from all burdens is not the goal.
Right.
You're supposed to have the right burdens, and
Right.
that's why even
Exactly.
Christ
Yeah.
says, my load is light. He says, I don't have a load for you.
Right.
So yeah,
Right.
let's continue then going on, but that's, I think, important.
Yeah. Okay. So we want to get a sense of this idea, because when we understand sort of what the unspoiled version of this work is, we'll be better able to understand what happens at the end of the next chapter, and the way in which sin and the consequences of sin alter the nature of this work. So we see here two words, all right, meant to describe the duties of man within the garden. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at them one by one and then consider them together. So we're actually going to take the rest of this episode and the next episode just to examine this first word. And then the following episode after that, we'll look at the meaning of the second word and then bringing the two ideas together. So the first word we see here is abad, A-B-A-D. I don't know if my pronunciation is correct, but we'll go with that.
Feel free to email us with the correct pronunciation if you have.
Yes, sure, have at it. And so that is meant to cultivate, to work, to serve, to till, and even enslave. So as we've done a few times here already, I sort of actually think the best way to really grasp what's being expressed in this sentence is to try and come up with a conceptualization of what's being expressed that overlaps these different meanings and kind of brings them all in together, right? Mm-hmm. Because I don't think our English terms necessarily do a good job of bringing that idea fully together. Yeah. So I think we can start by considering together almost the ideas of to cultivate, to work, and to till, right? Which is like to till the soil. And that clearly, I think, is about intentional ordering, right? An intentional ordering of the garden. When you cultivate something, you don't let it run free. You have some intent in the way that you want it to grow, the way you want it to fit within the garden, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what we can see then is that man is put in the garden in order to give it order, right? But it's a little bit more than that, right? Because to cultivate, that is something that implies improvement, right? Bringing something up and making it better than it is. So it's not like it's just a job of maintenance. It's also a job of advancement, of making things even better, right? And so if we hark back to Genesis 1, I think we can look at this and say that man is meant to bring the garden along further in line with God's divine order.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a sense of not pushing with that. There's a sense of the idea of cultivation feels like creating the proper circumstances for something to thrive in the way that it's intended.
Yes.
And
yes.
So
and that's going to come in very significantly actually next episode. But yes, very much.
Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Because when you're tilling something, when you're working the ground, your goal is you're not forcing the seed to grow. The seed is going to grow by some sort of divine magic that we don't understand. Well, we do understand scientific, I guess, right? But it's going to grow. We can't force those cells to expand and grow into a tree, but you can create the context and the things that surround it
which allow it
which
to
allow that
grow.
to happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what cultivation a lot of times is. So it's less pushing and more arranging and putting a scenario around it. Yeah.
Creating sort of the circumstances that allow it to be done best.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the first sense of it, which I think that's the easiest for us to associate with a garden, right? The idea
Yeah.
of work in a garden, tilling, cultivate. That's pretty easy for us to understand. Next, I want to look at the idea specifically of it being to serve, right? So it's interesting to think of what man is doing as when you're cultivating the garden, it's actually in service of those things which are in the garden,
Mm-hmm.
right? So symbolically, we might look at that and understand this then, that bringing things into God's order, into the divine order that he has set, is actually serving them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a place of service. It's a role of service.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, this makes good sense, right? Because if God had a purpose and role for things within the divine order, if there is this design, then things, the context in which God has for things to exist is the place in which those things become the best version of what they are,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is, the example that I think is easiest for Christians to understand with this, because it is such a central moral component of the Bible, is when it comes to the area of sex, right? Because sex is in the context of God's proper order, marriage, right? That is when sex is then practiced in its ideal form. And it is in that context that the act best serves the participants,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's that ideal form and service and place and context all wrapped up together, where a thing becomes the best version of that thing that it's meant to be. And then also likewise, sort of serves everyone else sort of out from that central point, right, where it's being the best version of itself. So in this passage, I think we might see that what God is saying here is that he's created all of earth, right? And the garden being the best representation of not the spiritual, but the natural world, the material world that God's created. The garden is the best representation of that. So all of creation has an ideal context. It has a place in which it is being used correctly. We see this in Ecclesiastes, right? A time and a season for all things.
Mm-hmm.
There is a place for everything, and in that proper context, that's what it means to cultivate, is to use things in that proper context, right? And this is the nature of gardens, right? A garden is a place where a thing is the best version of itself based on its place within everything else that's in the garden, right?
Mm-hmm.
We emphasize the flower because of where it is around other things, and the tree becomes a central component. And then we talked about the idea of a gazebo in the center of the garden, or whatever it is, right? And so the idea being here, when we bring divine order to the earthly, we are serving it. We're allowing it and helping it to be the best thing that it can be.
Yeah, I think another illustration of this that comes to mind is what proper leadership tends to look like within the context of an organization or a group. It is in vogue at the moment, I think, to look at anybody who is in a position of leadership as being in a position of absolute power and absolute luxury, and something to be resentful of and jealous of.
Right.
But the frame of proper leadership that for most of humanity has been established is one in which the leader is one who is serving others. And I think this is best illustrated by saying, like, look, let's say you're a low-level employee at a particular company and they let you be CEO for a day, really CEO for a day. I think 98% of people say, oh, no way. I'm not,
right.
like, they get a day of doing it and are like, no way I'm going to do that.
Right.
Because the occupation itself is incredibly stressful and difficult. And when you're looking at a person who's in a position like that, it's like, yeah, there might be power associated and issues associated with it, but at the same time, understanding that as a place of service, that person is serving downwards and allowing employment for a bunch of other people,
and
allowing
trying to
people a
allow
place
the
in
people
life
below them to be the
to
best version
thrive.
that they can be within
Exactly.
that,
In order to operate properly
Yeah.
in that context and really
Yeah.
be able to, yeah, exactly. And so I think that's
I mean,
where
a similar example is sports, right? Football.
Mhm.
We might look at quarterbacks, and one of the ways people look at a quarterback is they ask, do they make their teammates better, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Are their receivers better when they're with them playing versus
Exactly.
somebody else? Are the running backs better? Everyone is our players made better by the presence of that individual. And
Exactly.
that's, good leadership is when that happens.
Exactly. Yeah. So this service aspect, I think, is fundamental to understanding proper work. Yeah, that's huge.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's one left, and I didn't want to make this episode too full because that next one, it's a bit complex. So in the next episode, we're going to consider what's added to this idea that we have so far. So far, we have cultivation, service, this kind of thing. All things we generally look at as, what was that?
All positive words.
Yeah, I was just going to say all things we generally look at with a very positive perception. And now we're going to add this idea of to enslave. So there's quite a bit to unpack with what's going on right there. So be sure to follow us so you can see that episode next time. Like, subscribe, all those things, comment, review, all of that. And email us if you have any questions. We're unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you next time. Thanks.